Let's talk about the judicial branch of government, justice, and why it's important in Canadian society. But first, remember this? When we talked about how Canada is a constitutional monarchy with a parliamentary democracy, with an executive branch with the Prime Minister and their cabinet, and a legislative branch with the Senate and the House of Commons? Well, those were just two of the three branches of government. And if you're wondering why we didn't cover all three branches before, you didn't know how someone could become Prime Minister through a leadership race, so don't even. Now, the legislative branch creates laws, but the judicial branch interprets and applies those laws through a court system, making sure that they are consistently and fairly applied to all Canadian citizens. And part of that means defending the Canadian Constitution, which includes the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Remember this? Good times. Because if a law is passed by the legislative branch, but it violates the Constitution, then the judicial branch can strike it down. It is a very important part of Canada's system of checks and balances. So let's break it down. Our court system in Canada looks kind of like this, with the Supreme Court of Canada at the top, the federal courts, provincial and territorial courts, and military courts. And different types of courts handle different types of cases. For example, a civil case is between individuals or organizations, and they're looking to resolve private disagreements, often by seeking financial compensation. And criminal cases involve the government prosecuting an individual for violating public laws. But the cases can also be different because they fall under different jurisdictions. Remember when we talked about the different levels of government and how they had different responsibilities? Well, it's kind of like that because some laws fall under provincial or territorial jurisdiction, and some fall under federal jurisdiction. For example, family matters fall under provincial or territorial jurisdiction, whereas copyright infringement is a federal matter. And we have different levels of courts. So, if a judgment is made in a lower court, say provincial court, it can be appealed to a higher court, like a provincial superior court. Appellate courts are really important because they give us a chance to have our case reviewed even once a judgment is made. And an appeal doesn't mean that we have to redo court proceedings like a trial, it just means that a higher court reviews the record of the lower court to make sure that there weren't any errors. And more serious matters start at a higher level of court. So provincial court will usually deal with small claims, traffic offenses, and parenting arrangements, but things like divorce and murder or civil suits with larger amounts of money will go straight to provincial superior court. The judicial branch also has these things called tribunals, and we have them on a provincial level and a federal level. And they're not courts, they don't have judges, they have a board of adjudicators, but their decisions can be reviewed by higher courts through a process called judicial review. Now, why would we want tribunals, you ask? Well, they're set up to be less expensive and faster at resolving disputes. They're highly specialized, which makes for more informed and effective decision-making, and they're also more accessible and less formal than courts. Court is expensive, and the wait times are usually longer. And similarly to how the specialization of tribunals helps things run a little bit more smoothly, there is a separate court for taxes and a separate court system for military personnel. Another important thing to note is that judges are appointed and not elected, and there are some good reasons for that. Because we want the judicial branch to be independent of the legislative branch, which means that it should be politically neutral, with the priority being upholding the law and protecting the Constitution. Elections would politicize judges and push them to campaign on ideologies, and remember that some ideologies are harmful to humans. Elections might also influence judges to make decisions in favor of public opinion rather than just the law. So instead, the Governor-General appoints federal judges based on recommendations by the federal government, and the provinces and territories appoint judges to their respective courts, and an advisory board and the Governor-General appoint Supreme Court judges. The processes and requirements are varied and complicated, so we won't have time to get into that here. Now, hopefully you're already getting a good idea of how important the judicial branch is to our daily lives in Canada, but in case you aren't, then think about it this way. If you exist within these lines, then you are subject to the federal laws of Canada, with very few exceptions. In addition, you are also subject to provincial or territorial laws depending on where you are. And that's part of why it's so important to have your say in who's passing laws, and why it's important to know, understand, and care about our legal rights. Because legal rights aren't only important in situations where people are intentionally doing bad things. They're important to everyone at all times that they exist within a jurisdiction. When you accept money from people, legal rights are important. If you accidentally hit somebody with your car, legal rights are important. If a friend of yours is accused of murder, legal rights are important. And if you are imprisoned, legal rights are important. And here's a hard one. Even if you did intentionally do something bad, your legal rights are important. Why? Because human rights are important, and we are all humans, even ones who do bad things, even ones that many of us would say are bad humans. And in Canada, we have decided that certain actions will have certain consequences that remove certain rights, but not our basic human rights. Think about it this way. If you hurt society, then society can stop you from hurting society. But society can't stop you from being a human. We'll talk more about this super fun topic in a different video, because we need to talk about one more thing that relates to the separation of these branches and our rights. And that would be the difference between these two things, the Emergencies Act and the Notwithstanding Clause. The Emergencies Act is a federal law that lets the government take special temporary measures to ensure safety and security during national emergencies, like war emergencies, international emergencies like a threat to Canada from an outside country, public order emergencies, and public welfare emergencies. And it can be used to restrict movement by doing things like enforcing curfews or limiting protests. And it was used in 2022 for the convoy protests in Ottawa because of the seriousness of the situation. Remember that in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, our right to assembly is protected, but it doesn't give us the right to infringe on other people's rights. Now, one important thing to note about the Emergencies Act is that an inquiry is automatically triggered 60 days after it is enacted to determine whether or not the act was used properly. Now, the Notwithstanding Clause lets federal and provincial governments enact legislation even if it violates other rights in the Charter. For 5 years, and there's nothing that Canadians can do about it. It was meant to give governments, usually provincial governments, the ability to block legislation when they disagreed with how the courts balanced a rights violation in a given case. But certain parties on this side of this line have made it very clear that they intend to use the Notwithstanding Clause to push through certain unconstitutional legislation, meaning that they intend to use it preemptively, which is some real authoritarian shit. In fact, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms exists to protect Canadians from people like us on this stage, politicians who may use their power to override fundamental rights, and the issue in using by the federal government is not where you start, but where will you stop.